Okay, I'm going to read from chapter 9. And this is Chase and Tavia's story, in case everybody is not familiar. And this chapter takes place after Chase has been arrested by the human law enforcement. And some things happen, he's broken out of jail, and now he's going after Tavia. Okay. Tavia lingered in the hotel suite shower, unwilling to let go of the decadent, undisturbed solitude. It didn't bother her too much that she wasn't exactly alone. The pair of federal agents and the uniformed officer who had brought her there that day were down the short hallway in the living room of the spacious quarters. Separated from her by two closed doors, her private bathroom and bedroom, the men were currently engrossed in a basketball game they turned on a few minutes before she'd excused herself to have a shower and take a nap until room service arrived with dinner. Under the warm spray of the water, she heard the tinny chatter of the television in the living room, accompanied by an occasional shout of dismay or a triumphant whoop from the men watching the game. She had been surprised when Officer Murphy informed her she'd be spending the night at the hotel, possibly more than one, under armed watch. The hard-eyed cop with the sinister scar across his eyebrow had been her close companion all day, since the moment he and Detective Avery had taken her away from Senator Clarence's office that morning. God, it was all so surreal. She had no experience being an eyewitness to a crime, yet alone one in need of police protection at an undisclosed location. In truth, though, it didn't seem much different from her usual home life, never left totally on her own, someone forever checking on her well-being, encroaching on her privacy whenever they liked, with the reasoning that it was all simply for her own good. She'd never felt particularly helpless or infirm, regardless of what Dr. Lewis and Aunt Sarah seemed to think. Admittedly, her body rebelled on her from time to time, whether in reaction to new treatments for her mystifying condition or in situations of heightened stress. Tavia had never quite figured out how to predict the onslaught of her spells, as Aunt Sarah referred to them. Dr. Lewis said she had an unusual form of epilepsy, complemented by a host of other strange ailments that required her to be in his specialized care from the time she was a baby. The silver-haired physician had been as much a father figure to her as Aunt Sarah had been the only mother she'd ever known. Tavia hadn't seen so much as a photograph of her birth parents, having lost both of them in a vicious house fire that had somehow miraculously spared her. All she had to remind her of the past she had lost were the scars that covered nearly all of her body. Tavia lathered the small bar of hotel soap and ran it along her arms and torso, then down the length of her legs. The scars tracked nearly everywhere she touched, even up onto her neck, painless for as long as she could remember. Based on how much of her body they covered, the scars should have looked more severe than they did. Dr. Lewis's treatments had worked some kind of magic on them, apparently. They were still hideous to her, of course, a relentless webwork of pinkish tan skin that could be hidden only beneath turtleneck collars, long sleeves, and slacks. The conservative dress code of her job with the senator had been a blessing. Not even he had known of her extensive flaws or her complicated medical conditions. To him and to everyone else she came in contact with, Tavia was reserved, professional, and exacting. Her work life was the only thing she felt truly in control of, and she had made it her mission to be perfect in every way possible. God knew she had no personal life to worry about. Only Aunt Sarah, who had given up her own personal life to devote herself to looking after her dead brother's child. The older woman never spoke of her past or the dreams she might have held as a young woman. She had never married, never regretted the fact that she'd gone without a family or children of her own. Tavia often wondered why her aunt had made the choice to appoint herself lifelong guardian and caretaker of her niece. Not that she hadn't posed that question more than once. Aunt Sarah would merely smile placidly whenever asked about those things and dismiss all questions with a kindly pat on Tavia's hand. "Don't you fret about me, dear. You're what's important, and I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Too bad Aunt Sarah didn't feel the same about dissecting every action and thought of Tavia's. She wanted to know everything, always, but she never got angry or impatient, not in all the time Tavia had known her. She never complained, which made Tavia feel a bit guilty to be enjoying a few hours away from Aunt Sarah's constant attention now. In 27 years, she'd spent less than an accumulated month away from home, counting business trips with the senator and the occasional emergency overnight observation and treatment at Dr. Lewis's private care clinic. Aunt Sarah was never unconcerned on any of those occasions, but when Tavia spoke with her on the phone earlier tonight, after the news and cable networks had been broadcasting the report of Senator Clarence's murder on practically every station for most of the day, the woman was as upset as Tavia had ever heard her. It had taken 15 minutes just to convince her that Tavia was safe, particularly when the federal agents and officers had forbade her from disclosing to anyone where she was staying. Tavia was sure that if Aunt Sarah was given the hotel name or address, she would have been knocking on the door as soon as she could get there. She had fretted that Tavia wasn't telling her everything, which she wasn't. "I don't understand, dear. Are you in some kind of trouble? Why would the police need you to stay somewhere overnight?" They have a lot of questions for me yet, Aunt Sarah. The detective in charge of the investigation thought it would be more convenient if I stayed in the city, so we can talk some more tonight, then start again early in the morning. But they don't know about your condition. You're not well, Tavia. You should be home, not stuck somewhere for their convenience. I'm perfectly fine, she'd insisted, but it had been clear that Aunt Sarah hadn't totally believed it. 10 more minutes had been spent assuring her that Tavia did indeed have her medicines, all of them, including the small stash she kept on hand in case of an emergency, such as this that might delay her from getting home as expected, in her pocketbook. Tavia didn't have the energy to explain that she might be gone for more than one night, nor did she divulge the fact that she'd convinced Detective Avery to send an unmarked squad car to Aunt Sarah's neighborhood to make sure none of the danger Tavia might be in spilled over onto her only living relative. Don't worry about me, Aunt Sarah, she told the old woman as gently as she could. I'm going to be all right, I really will. The conversation had left her feeling more stifled than protected. She hated begrudging Aunt Sarah's concern, but there were times when Tavia couldn't picture a future without her aunt in her life, under the same roof. She felt trapped, suffocating with it, at the same time shamed by even this small resentment for a woman who clearly wanted only what was best for her. Tavia put her head under the warm spray and worked a dollop of shampoo into her long hair. She scrubbed her scalp, feeling the nearly imperceptible outlines of the curved tangle of old scars that tracked up the back of her nape and into her hairline. She rinsed away the soap, then squirted some of the conditioner into her palms and smoothed it on. In the other room of the suite, a game horn sounded on the television, marking the end of a shot clock. The men's voices carried as they argued the last play and made cutting remarks about the out-of-town team. Tavia took her time rinsing off, dousing her hair and body, reluctant to let go of the warm, wet peace she was enjoying. But with her stomach starting to growl and the men waiting to order dinner for themselves until she was ready to eat too, she finally reached out to crank the lever on the tub and shower's water supply. It cut off with a squeak. And then, silence. An unnatural, ominous silence. Naked and dripping, she peeked out from behind the plastic curtain, listened for a long moment. Nothing but quiet, not even the sound of the television running now. Hello? She called anxiously. Officer Murphy? She stepped out onto the bath mat. No time to bother with a towel, she grabbed the terry hotel robe from its hook on the back of the door and wrapped it around herself. Wet strands of hair drooped into her face as she hastily tied the belt at her waist and crept forward to put her hand on the doorknob. Something was wrong, very wrong. She could feel it in every fiber of her being, nerve endings jolting with sudden, certain alarm. She slipped out to the empty bedroom and padded silently toward the closed door that led to the suite's living quarters just down the hall. As she neared, a muffled groan cut short in the other room, followed by a hard thump that vibrated the floor beneath her bare soles. Tavia froze. She didn't need to open the door to know that death waited on the other side, but she couldn't keep her hand from quietly turning the knob. She peered out through the smallest wedge of space she dared. Her eyes met the unseeing gaze of Officer Murphy, lying motionless at the other end of the hallway. A big man, yet his neck was twisted and broken like a doll's, his head turned at a morbid angle on the floor. Tavia's heart slammed hard against her ribcage. Had the intruder killed them all? It was him. She knew it with a visceral certainty that throbbed in her veins. Her instinct screamed for her to get out of there now. She spun on her heel and hurried to the curtain slider on the far side of the bed. Fumbling with the lever lock on the handle, she finally wrenched the glass door open and the screen. A wintry gust swept inside, blowing fine, icy snowflakes into her eyes. 2 steps out onto the frigid concrete balcony, she stopped short and exhaled a hissed curse. The room was 10 stories above the street. No way out, not from here. Whatever was going on in the suite outside her bedroom, she was trapped in the middle of it. Shit. Tavia backed away from the open slider. She turned around and came up short with a gasp. The man from her nightmares, the deranged psychopath who had murdered Senator Clarence in cold blood and undoubtedly now wanted to finish her off too, stood less than 2 inches from her face. She opened her mouth to scream but didn't manage even the smallest sound before he clamped one hand around the back of her neck and the other came down swiftly across her lips. His grip was strong, unbreakable. Wild-eyed, terrified, she reached up to grab at his fingers, but they resisted like iron. Be still, he rasped, a curt command. His voice was rough and deep, far more powerful up close than it had been last night at the police station. There was something fuller about the grim set of his mouth, too, and something not quite right about his eyes. At first she dismissed their odd ember-like glow as a trick of her panicked mind. The pupils seemed distorted somehow, stretched thin and narrow in the center of his burning irises. Impossible that it could be anything but imagined. But no, it wasn't distress that made her see it. This was real as the unrelenting heat of his hands on her, fingers searing her nape and pressing hotly against her mouth. As real as the sharp, elongated white tips of his teeth, which glinted as he parted his lips to speak once more. I'm not going to hurt you, Tavia. Oh God, here was her nightmare standing before her in real life. He wasn't human, he couldn't be. Her mind rejected the word that leapt at her from out of the horror stories and dark fiction Aunt Sarah had chided her for reading when she was a child. Tavia wasn't sure what he was, but she didn't believe even for a second that he wasn't going to kill her in that next instant like he had the senator and the men in the other room. She struggled against him with all she had now, attempting to twist and fight her way free, but she couldn't budge him off of her. He was strong as any monster should be. And with the sudden surge of adrenaline into her bloodstream, Tavia felt her body begin to rebel beneath the forced calm that her medicines provided. Her heart rate jackhammered, sending her pulse throbbing in her temples. She groaned against the fingers that held her mouth closed, all the while trying to will herself out of an anxiety tailspin. He maneuvered her around and pushed her down onto the bed. No, her mind screamed, the physical cry snuffed in her throat. She was on her back and struggling uselessly, his hand still flat on her lips. The other had come swiftly around from behind her neck, only to rest across her brow. Here he touched her lightly, the warmth of his broad palm barely skimming the surface of her skin. Relax, Tavia, he said, that low, graveled growl, not so much menacing now as coaxing. Close your eyes. She bucked, thrashing her head beneath the odd comfort of his words. He seemed confused that she wouldn't comply. Those inhuman eyes narrowed, pinning her in a scathing amber glow. Sleep. It was a command this time, his hand still held to her forehead. She glared up at him in defiance, letting him read her fury in her own seething gaze. Fighting with her legs, slamming her fists futilely against the rock-solid muscles of his back and shoulders, she made another desperate attempt to break free. As she shifted and fought, she felt cool air hit the naked skin of her chest. Her hotel robe gaped open in a wide downward V, bearing her to his gaze from throat to navel, bearing the worst of her skin's flaws. He stared, then he swore. Holy hell. Tavia moaned, humiliation making her fright compound into something even more terrible. It was awful enough to be assaulted and in fear of her life. Now this astonishingly inhuman being gaped at her as though she were the freak. The press of his palm against her mouth fell away on another, more vivid curse. Head cocked in an animalistic angle, his wild amber eyes came back up to her face in obvious disbelief. What the fuck is this? He was hallucinating. Had to be. Chase knew what bloodlust could do to one of his kind. He understood how the disease could corrode logic, rob the senses and reason until nothing remained of even the soundest mind. He'd sure as hell felt it nipping at his own sanity in recent days. Bloodlust had been raking him hard after he left the detective back at the police station parking lot. The hand-to-hand combat with the two unconscious feds and the dead minion lying in the other room had made it even worse. He was in a bad way, and he knew, but never had his affliction manifested in such a crazed mental trick as it did now, because what he thought he was seeing on Tavia Fairchild's bared skin was impossible. A pattern of dense but delicate markings tracked her body from neck to torso. They were light-colored, a faint mauve barely darker than her own fair skin tone. To his impaired vision, swamped in the amber light of his hunger, the webwork of interconnecting flourishes and twining swirls looked like something he was intimately familiar with. The markings looked very much like breed dermaglyphs. Okay. More. Shall I go on? Yeah. Do you want me to go on? Seriously? Okay. Impossible, he said, hearing his own confusion in the feral growl of his voice. Skin designs like these occurred only on his kind, and courtesy of a genetic anomaly of the race, beginning when the ancients sired their young on breed mates and created the breed, all of Chase's kind, for all the thousands of years they'd existed on this planet, were born male. Through the fog of his questionable reason, he was reminded of Jenna Darrow, the woman who had recently come to the Order from Alaska following an assault by the last of the ancients. Brock's human mate had marks like these now, but they were minor in comparison and caused by the alien DNA contained in the rice-sized bit of biotechnology the ancient had implanted in her during her ordeal. This was something altogether different. Where the thick terry robe was still loosely fastened at Tavia's waist, the intricate skin pattern disappeared beneath the folds of the fabric. He caught a glimpse of more on her hip as she tried to scramble away from him on the bed. Jesus, how far did they extend? He reached for the belted tie, about to yank it open. No, she cried, eyes fixed on him in abject horror as she drew the edges closed in trembling fists. Get away, don't touch me. Her fear jolted him from the insane tack his mind was taking. He hadn't come there to terrify her. His objective had been to see her safe, to make certain the minion cop accompanying her didn't harm her. At the same time, he'd been damn curious why Dragos would enlist one of his mind slaves to act as her guard. That question burned more fiercely as he stared down at her white-knuckled hands that gripped the robe closed over her body like her life depended on it. Chase laid his palm to her forehead once more, another attempt to trance her, but she had a strong mind that didn't want to go down easy. She fought the lull that should have put her under in just a few moments and would have made it easier for him to decide what to do with her next. She pushed and fought, refusing to surrender despite the fear that he could feel rolling off her tall, deceptively athletic body. And he had other problems stirring now. In the room outside, one of the federal agents Chase knocked unconscious was starting to rouse. If either of them woke and saw him there, eyes throwing off amber sparks and fangs extended to razor-sharp points, his mind scrub on them a few minutes ago would have been for nothing, and he didn't have time for a do-over. "Stand up," he growled at Tavia Fairchild. He took off his stolen coat and covered her with it, robe and all. Then he fisted his hand in the woolen lapels and hauled her up off the bed. "Come with me." He gave her little choice. Pulling her along the short hallway to the living room of the hotel suite, he ignored her choked gasp as she saw the signs of the struggle and the 3 large law enforcement personnel lying in crumpled heaps on the floor. Her breath was coming fast and hard now, on the verge of hyperventilation. "You killed them," she cried. "Oh, God, let me go." "I only killed the one who needed killing," he said as he dragged her through the room, past the dead minion. One of the feds moaned, started to move where he lay on the floor nearby. It would only be seconds before he came to, and Chase needed to be gone before that happened. "Please," Tavia choked, "please don't do this. Tell me what you want from me." God help him, he wasn't sure how to answer that now. All he knew was he had to get out of there and he couldn't leave her behind, so she was coming with him. When she sucked in a breath and he felt her prepare to let it loose in a scream, he brought the minion cop's gun around from the back waistband of his pants where he'd stashed it after the scuffle. All it took was one look at the weapon and she got quiet. He never would have used it on her. He was breed, and that gave him about a dozen other ways he could have threatened her into silence, but the pistol spoke the most convincingly to her mortal sensibilities. "This way," he ordered her, quickly. Shocked and confused, she didn't resist. Chase pushed her into the empty hotel corridor outside the suite, then hustled her toward the back stairwell. More? Oh, God. Oh. All right. This is a kind of a, all right, I'll just keep going. You can tell me when to stop. Fresh from a shower, Lucan stepped out of the French doors of his and Gabrielle's private bedroom at the main compound and stood alone on the timber deck. He was naked, beads of water still clinging to his skin, which steamed in tendrils all around him as he walked into the brittle night air. It was cold this far north and this deep into winter, punishingly so. He breathed it in, let it clear his mind and crystallize his thoughts around mission goals and duty, the things he knew best, the burdens he'd elected to carry on his shoulders alone when he founded the Order all those centuries ago. He had never resented that choice, and he'd be damned if he let himself start doing so now. On a muttered curse, he inhaled another lungful of bracing cold and pushed it deep down, determined to smother the strange ache that had been troubling him all day. It had plagued him longer than that, he had to admit, although it had taken seeing Gabrielle with Dante and Tess's baby before the disturbing ache, the unwanted void, had given itself a name. It was longing, bone deep and undeniable. Christ, he was sick with it. He saw his beloved mate near the small breed infant and knew an instant, intense yearning to see her swell with his own sons. Everything male in him had roared with the need to claim her in that most primal, basic way. In that moment earlier today, he had wanted it more than anything he'd ever known. And that was something he could not afford to feel right now. Not when their world was in the midst of war with Dragos and everyone was looking to Lucan to lead. Bad enough he worried for Gabrielle every time he left her behind to walk into combat. He couldn't bear to think of possibly leaving her to raise his child alone. That was why he'd always frowned on warriors taking a mate, had all but forbidden any of them from starting a family while serving the Order. It was just 2 summers ago when this point had proven out tragically in the Boston compound, when Conlon, a member of the Order for more than 100 years, took a fatal blast of bomb shrapnel and C4 explosives while on patrol pursuing a minion. Conlon's grieving widow, Danica, had been forced to release her dead mate to the sun while pregnant with their firstborn. She had decided to leave Boston soon afterward, devastated and bereft. Not that the painful lesson had been warning enough to any of the other warriors to avoid emotional entanglements. Somehow, within the space of less than 2 years, they'd nearly all taken breedmates, Lucan himself included. Things had only gotten more complicated when Nico and Renata brought 8-year-old Mira in with them as their own child when they'd paired up some 6 months ago, and now Dante and Tess had newborn Xander Raphael. Lucan tilted his face up to glower at the pale gray wedge of a waning crescent moon peeking through the canopy of soaring pines overhead. He'd have to be a fool to think about adding another innocent life to the potential casualty list. Should this situation with Dragos escalate into the catastrophe Lucan dreaded was coming. He raked a hand through his damp hair and exhaled a curse into the frigid, dark night. "I didn't realize you'd come back already." Gabrielle's warm voice jolted him to attention. He turned to face her and was struck, as always, by how beautiful she was. Tonight her long auburn hair was swept up off her delicate nape in a loose twist, curling tendrils framing her pretty face and soothing brown eyes. She was dressed all in black, not the soft colors and easy lines she normally wore, but a low-cut silk blouse unbuttoned to just between her breasts. The fabric was filmy, skating over her alabaster skin and lacy black bra. Her skirt was fitted and clinging to her every curve, hinting at the flare of her hips and her long, lean legs. Sharp-toed, glossy leather boots lifted her a good 5 inches on thin stiletto heels. Damn, she was hot. No wonder he'd been doomed from the moment he first laid eyes on her. Lucan cleared his throat. "I got back about an hour ago. You look amazing." She smiled and walked out to meet him, crossing her arms around herself to rub at the cold. Her breath puffed in a light cloud as she spoke. "You've been home for an hour? What are you doing out here?" Lucan shrugged and brought her under the warmth of his sheltering arm. "Just getting some air." "It's freezing," she pointed out, "and you're naked." He put his mouth to her temple. "Suddenly, I wish you were, too." Her quiet laugh didn't seem as light as it sounded. "How did it go with Kellen tonight?" "He hunted," Lucan replied. "He fed." "That's good news?" Lucan grunted. "It'll be good news when he doesn't need to be told to do it or require an escort to make sure it happens." "He's been through a lot," Gabrielle reminded him, "and he's just a boy. Give him time." Lucan nodded, guessing she had a point. Kellen had been none too pleased to discover Lucan had been serious about taking him out personally to find a blood host that night if Lazaro hadn't already made firm plans to see the task done. At nightfall, Lucan had found a youth in the Order's makeshift weapons room, engaged in solo mock combat, wielding a pair of long daggers. He wasn't very good, all gangly arms and lanky, uncooperative legs, but he wouldn't have had much practice at battle while living in the Dark Havens. He'd almost cut off his foot with a fumbled blade when Lucan announced they were going hunting right then, just the two of them together. Lazaro Archer would have been perfectly capable and ready to take the boy himself, but Lucan had been curious. He'd taken Kellen to Bangor, the nearest city, with a decent population and enough public gathering places to select from without being noticed as anything more than tourists from away. Kellen had chosen an old drunk sleeping off a bender in the downtown park. Easy prey, but the exercise tonight hadn't been about challenge or technique. Lucan had stood back while the boy quickly fed, then left his blood host in a peaceful, trance-induced drowse. Kellen didn't say 2 words to him on the drive back to headquarters, but his eyes had lost their dark circles, and his skin color was flushed a ruddy, healthy pink from the feeding. Gabrielle turned a questioning look on Lucan. "You've been back all this time, but you didn't come to find me and let me know? That's not like you." He kissed her furrowed brow. "You were with Tess. I didn't want to disturb, in case they were resting. Besides, I'd asked Gideon for a systems check earlier today, and he'd been waiting for me to return." Gabrielle's inquisitiveness took on a suspicious edge. "If I didn't know better, I might think you were trying to avoid me." He scoffed at the idea, but part of him wondered if she could be right. He cast a dark glance up at the night sky and that damned sliver of a moon suspended within it. This was the fertile time for Gabrielle, and for every breedmate who shared a blood bond with one of Lucan's kind. It took blood and seed given together, a mutual feeding at the moment of release, during the cycle of a crescent moon, to create the spark of new breed life. The act was sacred, not to be entered into with any trace of doubt. Gabrielle stared at him in his silence. She took a small step forward, moving out from under his arm to gaze up at the black velvet sky herself. She released a small sigh, wordless but rife with understanding. She gave her back to the moon and faced him, leaning against the waist-high railing of the deck. "I hear there's been word from Hunter tonight. He and Corinne are on their way north?" Lucan nodded, more than willing to take her offered detour in the conversation. "He had to wait out the daylight in Pennsylvania, but they're on the road again tonight. They expect to make New England before daybreak, arriving here tomorrow night." It still seemed strange sometimes to think of Hunter as part of the Order, but the lethal Gen 1 who had once served as assassin for Dragos had proven himself to be a vital asset in the short time he'd been with the Warriors. Now he was returning from a mission in New Orleans, one that had netted the Order valuable intel from a key area of Dragos' operation. Hunter was bringing that intel with him. He was bringing something else, too, Corinne, his new mate, and the boy she had given birth to some 13 years ago while she'd been held captive in one of Dragos' genetics labs. "I can't say I'm surprised that Hunter and Corinne are together," Gabrielle remarked, as if she were tuned into Lucan's thoughts as much as her blood bond to him had connected them emotionally. They're both survivors of Dragos' evil. Now they have a fresh start together. Nathan, too, that poor child. Lucan considered Corinne's breed son, one of many sired on scores of imprisoned breedmates whom Dragos had used to create his own private army of first-generation breed assassins. Those genuine offspring all shared the same paternal DNA, taken from the ancient that Dragos had kept hidden in secret for centuries, enslaved to do his bidding until the other worlder escaped into the wilds of Alaska. That ancient was dead now, killed by the Order, after cutting a bloody swath through a number of settlements up there before the attack on Jenna had left her changed forever. Okay. Anyway.